Deep in the hollows of the Appalachian Mountains, where the mist clings to the pines like a shroud and the wind whispers secrets through the crags, there lived a girl named Eliza. Her world was a narrow one, bounded by the steep ridges that rose like ancient sentinels around the weathered cabin she called home. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and wood smoke, and the nights were alive with the distant calls of creatures unseen. Eliza's father, a man carved from the same unyielding stone as the hills, had always been her protector, her teacher, her everything. But as the seasons turned and the shadows lengthened, something insidious began to stir in the quiet spaces between them, a hunger that no amount of isolation could quell. It started with lingering touches, excuses to draw her close by the flickering hearth, where the firelight danced like malevolent eyes. Eliza felt it first as a chill, a prickling unease that crawled beneath her skin, but the mountains had a way of twisting fates, binding blood in ways that defied the light of day. Little did she know, the folklore of these forsaken peaks held tales of daughters ensnared by their sires, their unions birthing not just kin, but curses that echoed through the valleys for generations. As the first frost etched patterns on the windowpanes, Eliza's innocence began to fracture, and the true horror of her heritage crept ever closer, ready to claim her in the unrelenting grip of the dark. The cabin sat in a narrow crease of the mountain where the sun only found the porch for a couple of hours each morning, and even then it came in thin, reluctant slivers that barely warmed the puncheon floor. Eliza had grown tall and quiet in that half-light, her days measured by the chores that never changed, drawing water from the spring that tasted of iron and leaf rot, feeding the hogs, mending clothes already patched a dozen times. She was 16 the autumn everything tilted, though she wouldn't understand the tilt for months yet. Her father had always watched her. That wasn't new. When her mother was alive, his gaze had been proud, almost fierce, the way a man looks at a colt he's raised from a shaky foal into something strong and fine. After the fever took her mother 2 winters back, the pride stayed, but something else crept in alongside it, something that made Eliza's stomach knot when she caught him staring from the barn doorway or across the supper table. His eyes lingered too long on the curve of her neck when she bent to stir the beans, on the way her dress clung to her hips after she'd been hauling firewood. At first she told herself it was grief making him strange, that losing a wife hollowed a man out and left him grasping for anything familiar. She was all he had left, after all. But the touches began. A hand resting on the small of her back when he passed behind her in the narrow dog-trot, longer than necessary. Fingers brushing a loose strand of hair from her cheek when she sat shelling peas, the thumb grazing her skin slow enough to feel deliberate. At night, when the wind rattled the tin roof and the fire burned low, he'd call her to sit close, saying the cold was worse than it used to be, that her warmth kept the ache from his bones. She'd obey because obedience was woven into her like the warp in a loom, but each time she felt the weight of his arm across her shoulders settle heavier, the heat of his body pressing against her side until her heart hammered with something between fear and a shame she didn't yet have words for. She started finding excuses to stay outside longer, chopping kindling until her palms blistered, lingering by the creek to watch the water slide black over the stones. Anything to delay going back into that single room where the air felt thick and watchful. Yet every evening the mountains pushed her home, the ridges folding together like a fist closing, and she'd step through the door to find his eyes waiting, patient as a spider in the center of its web. The gaze that once made her feel safe now made her feel caught. October came down the mountain like a judgment. The sky turned the color of a fresh bruise and stayed that way for days, and the wind carried a bite sharp enough to draw blood from the ears. One morning the clouds dropped so low they scraped the treetops, and by noon the first hard flakes began to fall, fat and deliberate, as though the heavens had decided to bury the hollow entire. Eliza felt the shift in the air the way animals feel earthquakes hours before the ground splits. She was on the porch skinning a rabbit when the temperature plunged so fast her breath smoked white and thick. Her father stepped out behind her, coatless despite the cold, and stood watching the sky with the stillness of a man reading signs only he could see. "It's gonna be a norther," he said, voice low, almost satisfied. "The kind that don't let go easy." By nightfall the snow was already knee-deep and climbing. The trail that switchbacked down to the valley vanished under white, and the creek froze with a sound like rifle shots echoing up the gorge. The world narrowed to the circle of yellow lamplight inside the cabin and the howl outside that rose and fell like something alive and furious. They were cut off now, truly cut off. No neighbor could reach them, no preacher, no law, not even the revenue men who sometimes prowled these ridges looking for stills. Just the two of them, the crackling fire, and the storm that pressed against the walls as if it meant to get in. He barred the door with the heavy oak timber he hadn't used since the night a panther screamed too close to the stock pen. Then he turned the key in the lock, slow and deliberate, and dropped the key into the pocket of his overalls. The click of iron on iron sounded louder than the wind. Eliza's hands stilled over the dough she was kneading. Flour drifted from her fingers like pale ash. When she looked up, his eyes held hers across the room, steady, unblinking, shining wet in the firelight. Outside, the storm kept building, sealing them in tighter with every passing hour, the snow piling against the door until the hinges groaned under its weight. Inside, the silence between father and daughter grew its own kind of pressure, thick and waiting, while the mountain itself seemed to lean down and listen. The first sign was the way the hogs refused her feed. Eliza rattled the bucket and called, but they pressed into the far corner of the pen, squealing like she carried death itself. 2 days later her mother couldn't keep water down. The woman who had chopped wood and carried 100-pound sacks of cornmeal up the mountain path now lay curled on the pallet, skin grey as wood ash, lips cracked and bleeding though the fever burned her hot enough to blister a hand laid on her brow. Eliza boiled willow bark until the cabin stank of bitter steam, spooned broth between her mother's teeth, wiped the sweat that poured off her in rivers. Her father sat on the bench whittling, the knife moving steady, shavings curling like pale tongues onto the floor. He never looked at the sickbed for long. When he did his eyes were flat, almost thoughtful, the way a man studies a tree he's already decided to fell. On the 7th night the wind dropped and the snow stopped, leaving a silence so complete it rang in the ears. The mother's breathing turned wet and rattling. Eliza dozed in the rocker with her head on the quilt's edge and woke to find the room colder than it had any right to be. The fire still burned, yet frost feathered the inside of the window glass. Her mother's eyes were open wide, fixed on something just past Eliza's shoulder. A thin line of blood ran from one nostril, bright against the pallor. Then the gaze went blank and still. Eliza screamed once, a sound torn out of her chest like a root ripped from stony ground. Her father was already moving. He closed the dead woman's eyes with 2 fingers, gentle as shutting a book, then lifted the body, light as a child now, and carried it to the lean-to where the cold would keep it until the ground thawed enough for digging. Snow sifted through the chinks in the wall and settled on the corpse's hair like a veil. When he came back inside he smelled of ice and pine. He hung his coat, washed his hands in the basin, and only then looked at Eliza where she knelt on the floorboards, arms wrapped around herself, rocking. Without a word he crouched, drew her against him, pressed her face into the rough wool of his shirt that still carried the scent of outdoors and death. His hand stroked her hair, slow, almost tender, while the fire popped and the mountains held their breath around the widowed cabin and the girl who was now the only woman left in it. The burial was over in 20 minutes. The ground was still iron-hard, so they laid her mother under a cairn of fieldstones at the edge of the clearing, the way the old people used to do when winter refused a grave. Snow kept falling, soft and relentless, erasing footprints almost before they were made. When the last rock was set, Eliza's father stood there a long time, hat in his hands, staring down as if he expected the stones to speak. Then he turned and walked back to the cabin without looking to see if she followed. That night he poured 2 cups of the clear liquor he kept in a stone jug behind the flour barrel. Eliza had never tasted it before. It burned going down and settled in her stomach like hot coals. The fire was low, throwing long shadows that crawled across the walls and ceiling like living things. He sat on the bench, elbows on his knees, and began to talk in the slow, deliberate way he used when he meant every word to stick. He told her the mountain had its own laws, older than churches, older than the government men who came with papers and badges. Told her how their people first came here running from warrants and preachers both, carrying blood that had to stay undiluted or the gifts would fade. Gifts, he said, the second sight that let grandmothers find lost stock in the dark, the knowing when death walked close, the strength that let a man lift more than his share. All of it tied to the blood, and the blood had to circle back on itself every few generations or it thinned out like spring water after rain. He spoke of great-great-grandmothers who lay with their own fathers under the new moon, of uncles who took sisters to wife in caves no surveyor ever mapped. Said the children born of such joinings were marked, some with the call, some with eyes the color of creek ice, marked and protected. Said the mountain kept its bargains. If you gave it what it asked, it gave back in turn. His voice never rose, it stayed low, almost soothing, the way a man talks to a spooked horse. Eliza listened with the cup trembling in her hands, the liquor turning sour on her tongue. Outside, the wind moaned around the eaves like something hungry. He reached across the space between them and closed his big hand over hers, stilling the shake. His palm was warm, calloused, familiar, and the look in his eyes was ancient, patient, certain. The fire settled into embers, and the cabin filled with the smell of applewood smoke and the sharper scent of the liquor and something older underneath, something that had waited under these ridges since the first footfall of their kin. The weeks after the burial blurred into a single long dusk. Snow sealed the doors and windows with white silence, and the days grew so short the sun barely cleared the ridge before it bled out again. Eliza moved through the chores like a ghost, milked the cow that gave thinner and thinner streams, fed the fire, scrubbed the same pot until her knuckles cracked. Grief sat in her chest like a stone, but underneath it something else stirred, shame, maybe, or the first cold fingers of surrender. He never hurried her. That was the worst of it. He waited the way the mountain waits for spring, patient as granite. Some nights he read from the big family Bible by lamplight, voice rolling slow over the begats, lingering on the verses about daughters and the sons of God. Other nights he told stories of the old times, how the ridge runners kept their blood strong while the valley people married out and grew weak and sickly. His hand would find her knee under the table, rest there heavy and warm, thumb tracing small circles that made her skin prickle and her breath catch in her throat. One evening the wind shifted south and the snow turned to sleet that hissed against the tin roof like snakes. The fire burned high, fed with fatwood that snapped and threw sparks up the chimney. He pulled her onto his lap the way he had when she was small, only now her legs didn't fit, now her body pressed against his in ways that made heat rush to her face and between her thighs. She tried to stand, but his arms locked around her waist, gentle and unbreakable. "You're all I got left, girl," he murmured into her hair. "All the mountains got." She cried then, silent tears that soaked his shirt collar, but she didn't fight when he carried her to the bed her mother had died in only weeks before. The quilt still smelled faintly of willow bark and death, and the ropes creaked under their combined weight. Outside the sleet kept falling, sealing the world away. Inside, the lamp guttered low and the shadows merged until there was no telling where one body ended and the other began. His mouth tasted of corn liquor and sorrow, his hands knew every inch of her the way a farmer knows his own fields. When he pushed inside her it hurt, sharp and bright, then dulled into something vast and terrible that filled all the hollow places grief had carved out. Afterward he held her against his chest and stroked her hair until she slept, the fire popping soft in the hearth and the mountain listening outside the thin walls, satisfied at last. Spring came sideways that year, sneaking in on warm rains that melted the snow so fast the creek rose up brown and roaring, carrying fence posts and the bones of last year's hogs. Eliza's belly rose too, slow at first, then sudden and undeniable. She felt the quickening on a morning when the dogwoods were just beginning to bleed pink against the wet black trunks, a small hard flutter like a trapped moth beneath her ribs. She stood at the rain barrel with her palms pressed to the curve and knew, with a certainty that made her knees buckle, that the mountain had taken its bargain. The signs started small. The cow birthed a calf with too many joints in its legs, a thing that mewled and tried to stand on limbs that bent wrong, and her father took it into the woods with the axe before she could look long. Hens laid eggs soft as rotten fruit, shells collapsing under their own weight. One dawn she found the big red rooster hanging upside down from the porch rafter by its own entrails, though nothing had torn the screen, nothing had left tracks in the mud. At night the howls came closer. Not wolves, everyone knew wolves were long gone from these ridges, but something older that used wolf voices the way a man borrows a coat. They circled the clearing, low and laughing, then cut off sharp when her father stepped outside with the rifle. Once she woke to find frost on the inside walls in the shape of handprints too large to be human, fingers splayed across the logs as though something had stood there breathing while she slept. Her father only smiled when she whispered about the signs. Said the mountain was singing welcome to its own. Said every strong birth came with a little blood on the doorstep. He rubbed goose fat on her stretching belly and told her the child would have the old eyes, creek-ice eyes that saw what others couldn't. When she dreamed of her mother standing at the foot of the bed with black water pouring from her mouth, he woke her gentle, pressed her back down, and covered her mouth with his own until the dream broke apart. The pains began on a night when the moon was dark and the trees dripped like they were crying. Between the contractions she heard the howls again, closer than ever, threading through the thunder that rolled down the hollow. Her father boiled water and laid out the birthing knife, humming an old tune with no words, while the wind rattled the shutters and the mountains leaned in to watch. Years folded like quilt batting, thick and suffocating. For children came after the first, each one born in the same narrow bed, each one sliding into the world slick with her blood and the mountain's quiet approval. The oldest boy had the pale eyes her father bragged on, the color of water running over quartz. The youngest girl was born with a caul veined red as afterbirth, and her father peeled it away careful, dried it on the mantle like a trophy. They grew wild and silent, speaking little, watching everything with that same flat shine that made visitors, rare as they were, turn their mules around before they ever reached the porch. Eliza's sleep thinned to a thread. The dreams started small, her mother standing in the yard with snow in her hair and her mouth sewn shut with black thread. Then the woman began to walk, barefoot through the house at night, leaving wet prints that smelled of creek mud and grave mold. Some nights Eliza woke to find the children lined up at the foot of the bed, all 5 of them staring with identical unblinking eyes while something wearing her mother's face crouched on the rafters above, dripping. She saw others too. A girl with Eliza's own young face but hollow cheeks and a belly swollen tight as a drum, hanging from the big poplar by her braided hair. An old woman with too many teeth who sat in the rocker and knitted a shroud from strands of Eliza's own hair that she plucked while Eliza slept. Once she opened her eyes to find a circle of shadowy figures ringed around the bed, tall, thin, jointed wrong, humming in voices that scraped like briars. They reached for the youngest babe with fingers long as kindling, and she screamed herself hoarse until her father shook her awake, sweat-cold and shaking. He always soothed her back down, mouth on her throat, hands heavy on her hips, whispering that dreams were the mountain's way of reminding her who she belonged to. But the dreams grew teeth. She began seeing the children in them too, her children, older, feral, chasing something small and crying through the laurel hells while she ran after them barefoot and bleeding, unable to catch up, unable to call them by name because their faces kept shifting into her own and her father's mingled together until she couldn't tell where one ended and the other began. Some mornings she woke with bruises blooming on her thighs like purple handprints, with pine needles in her hair and her shift soaked through with dew though she had never left the bed. The line between sleeping and waking frayed thinner every season, until she caught herself listening for the scrape of bare feet on the tin roof at noon, until she flinched from shadows that moved a heartbeat too slow. The mountains watched, patient and ancient, and the children grew taller, their eyes paler, their smiles sharper, while Eliza drifted through the days half in the world and half already lost to whatever waited on the other side of sleep. August slid in wet and humming with flies, the kind of heat that made the trees sweat resin and the creek shrink to a chain of warm, scummed pools. Eliza was on the porch shelling late beans when the mule came picking its way up the trace, a gaunt, mud-colored animal with ribs showing like barrel staves. The rider was young, barely 20, with a preacher-black coat too heavy for the weather and a carpetbag tied behind the saddle. He raised a hand in greeting, voice cracking with relief at the sight of smoke curling from the chimney. He said his name was Caleb, that he was bound for the coal camps over the ridge to carry the word, that the storm 2 nights back had washed the footbridge out and left him lost. His eyes were wide and city-soft, the color of new leaves, and they lingered on Eliza's face, then dropped to the swell of her belly. She was carrying the 6th now, before flicking to the children who had appeared silent as cats in the doorway behind her. Her father was down at the still, but the young man didn't know that. He accepted the dipper of water Eliza offered, drank deep, and talked too fast about salvation and the narrow path, words spilling out like he'd been holding them for days. When he asked if he might rest the night, sleep in the barn, read from his little leather Bible after supper, something in Eliza's chest tore loose. She saw the clean line of his jaw, the unscarred hands, the way he looked at her like she was human instead of mountain property, and for one heartbeat she wanted to fall at his feet and beg him to take them all away. She fed him cornbread and beans. The children stared without blinking while he read in a trembling voice about the prodigal son. When her father's boots sounded on the path, Caleb stood polite, extended a hand, started to introduce himself. The rifle came up smooth as pouring water. The blast inside the small room was deafening, a red flower blooming sudden on the preacher coat. Caleb sat down hard, surprise still on his face, blood pumping bright between the fingers clutching his chest. Her father reloaded without hurry, then dragged the body out by the heels, leaving a wet trail across the puncheon floor. Eliza stood frozen, the children clustering close, their small hands sticky on her skirts. That night the hogs got more than scraps, and by morning the mule was gone, turned loose to wander until somebody else found it miles away with an empty saddle. The mountains swallowed the rest, carpetbag, Bible, black coat, everything, the way they had swallowed so many things before. When her father came back inside, he washed his hands in the basin, water running pink, then pulled Eliza against him hard enough to bruise. His mouth tasted of gunpowder and blood, and he took her right there on the table among the supper leavings while the children watched from the shadows with their pale, shining eyes. The night she decided to leave was the first hard frost of October, the kind that turns every blade of grass into a tiny knife and makes the moon look close enough to touch. Eliza waited until the house settled into the heavy breathing of sleep, her father on his back, one arm flung possessively across the empty side of the bed where she no longer lay, the children curled together like a litter of wild things in the loft. She had spent the day boiling the last of the poke salad and hiding cornbread in a flour sack, counting the bullets in the box above the mantel, stealing glances at the trail that disappeared into the laurel hell toward the gap. She dressed the little ones in every stitch they owned, tied their shoes with trembling fingers, whispered promises she barely believed, that the world beyond the ridge was wide and kind, that preachers and sheriffs and soft-handed women would take them in. The oldest boy, 10 now and already taller than her shoulder, watched her with those creek-ice eyes and said nothing, but when she lifted the youngest girl he moved to the door first and lifted the bar silent as smoke. They slipped out into air sharp enough to cut the lungs. Frost glittered on every twig, their breath hung white and vanished. Eliza carried the baby against her chest, the flour sack bundle on her back, and led the single-file line down the path that only showed itself when you knew where to look. Behind them the cabin squatted dark and waiting, chimney cold for the first time in years. They hadn't gone a quarter mile before the howl rose, not wolf, not dog, but something that used their voices the way a man borrows a mask. It came from everywhere and nowhere, rolling down the hollows, threading between the trees. The children froze. The youngest began to cry, a thin reedy sound that carried too far. Eliza hushed her with a hand over her mouth and tasted blood where her own teeth had cut the inside of her cheek. Then the footsteps started. Heavy, deliberate, unhurried. Her father's boots on the frozen ground, the rhythm she had known since childhood, coming closer through the laurel thicket that had no path. He whistled as he walked, the same 3 notes he used to call the hogs, only lower now, threaded with something that made the hair rise on her neck. The children pressed against her legs like frightened calves. The fog rolled in thick and sudden, swallowing the trail behind and ahead until there was only the small circle of their white faces and the crunch of his steps growing louder, patient, inevitable, the mountain itself walking in her father's skin. The fog pressed so close it felt like drowning on dry land. Eliza stumbled backward, the baby's weight dragging at her arms, the other children clinging to her skirts with fingers already numb from cold. The footsteps stopped. Silence rushed in, thick as wool packed in the ears. Then his shape formed out of the mist, tall and black against the moon-bleached trees, rifle hanging easy in the crook of one arm, the other hand held out palm up like he was calling a dog that already knew its name. She waited for the terror to crest, for the scream to tear loose, but what rose in her throat was something colder. Recognition. The mountain had spoken through him all her life, through the storms that sealed them in, the fever that took her mother, the dreams that clawed her awake, and now it spoke again in the steady rhythm of his breathing, in the pale shine of his eyes that were also her eyes, her children's eyes, the same ancient shine passed down like a brand. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. The children let go of her skirts and walked toward him, slow and certain, the oldest boy first, then the others in order of their birthing, until they stood in a half-circle at his feet like worshippers. The youngest girl lifted her arms to be carried, and he swung her up without looking away from Eliza's face. Something inside Eliza cracked open, not with horror but with a vast, exhausted relief. The running was over. The pretending was over. She saw it plain, Every path off this ridge looped back on itself, every prayer she'd whispered had been swallowed by these same trees, every tear she'd shed had soaked into this same ground and fed what grew here. The mountain had chosen its vessel, and it had chosen well. She dropped the flour sack. The cornbread scattered across the frost like pale stones. One step, then another, until she stood among her children, until his free arm closed around her shoulders and pulled her in. His mouth found hers, tasting of gun oil and wood smoke and home, and she kissed him back with the hunger of someone who has finally stopped fighting the current. Behind them the cabin waited, lamp already lit though no hand had touched the wick, fire already burning though no log had been laid. The door stood open in welcome. They walked toward it single file, father, mother, children, shadows stretching long and thin across the silvered ground, merging until there was no telling whose was whose. The fog folded around them gentle as a shroud, the mountain sighed once, satisfied, and the ridge closed behind them like a mouth.